Labor MP Ed Husic. Ed, thank you so much for your time. When it comes to this topic of IR reform, that seems pretty reasonable from the government's perspective to at least just be ordering a review based on the evidence. What are your thoughts on this story?
I think if you're an ordinary wage earner hearing that Coalition MPs are now rallying around making it easier to lose your job, you should be worried, because the same groups of people also pushed for changes to penalty rates that saw ordinary Australians lose $77 a week. They've pushed for lower superannuation outcomes and don't want to see superannuation guarantee levels increase. And now they want to make job security less secure in terms of what they're pushing. And this is a really bad outcome for wage earners, because it is a constant process of reducing take-home pay, contributing to underemployment, and seeing that sort of wage growth that has been stuck, has been absolutely floundering and hardly moving. You're seeing more evidence of what the Coalition are doing. They don't have a wages policy. All they've got is an idea of how people can lose wages and lose job security.
From the perspective of small and medium-sized businesses, they can be crippled by the inability to fire underperforming workers and the process that goes into that. Is it not reasonable that they should have more powers to keep their workforce moving and then, in turn, be able to get those wages into the hands of other workers?
I'd want to see the proof, because, you know, we got told by Coalition MPs who wanted to see penalty rate cuts that this would lead to better outcomes, more jobs, and then we saw the Small Business Industry Association say that penalty rate cuts that got paid for by ordinary wage earners did not contribute to a single job being created. So, you know, people are making these claims, saying that things will be better for businesses, but all we see is that ordinary wage earners pay the price for that. And I think there's a broader thing that's happening as well. You know, wages not moving is in part as a response to lower ability for employees to negotiate better outcomes. Their bargaining power has been weakened over time, particularly by Conservative governments. And I think we're getting to a point now where we can reasonably question whether or not enterprise bargaining is fit for purpose, because you've recently seen Treasury survey results of CEOs where 40% of CEOs said they would not pay wage increases to Australians that are waiting for them. So I think the whole system, the way it's going at the moment, goes disproportionately in favour of employers. It is not providing wage increases. And I think we've got to look at serious reform of the system, because, as I said, enterprise bargaining is just not, on the face of it, delivering for ordinary workers.
When it comes to that point where you've said you want to see the proof, is that not what Scott Morrison's asking for when he asks Christian Porter to make sure it's evidence-based, whatever the recommendations are?
I think a lot of us have been used to watching coalition governments say that they will work on the basis of a well-defined policy and then find that within their party room that absolutely gets butchered and messed up. The coalition backbench, particularly the hard right within the coalition, does not really care what Scott Morrison or Christian Porter thinks, and if anything, you will definitely see the tail wag the dog in this case, where those backbench MPs will not rest until they see what they can achieve. They did it on penalty rates and saw penalty rate cuts. They're pushing for superannuation increases not to happen, and now they're pushing for greater job insecurity. So I imagine this is what we're going to expect to see in the bulk of this term.
And just on that other point you made about changes needed to enterprise bargaining, what changes would you like to see in that space?
Well, if business isn't prepared to actually see, in a climate of increased profitability and where shareholders seem to be doing very well and where senior executive remuneration seems to be going very well, but they don't want to pay their workers, you know, it's clear what attitude they're taking to the enterprise bargaining table. Now, they're going to be their own worst enemy's business if they are not prepared to see those increases through. It then begs the question, do we move to a more centralised or go back to a more centralised form of wage setting where we do that through a centralised basis? Now, some people will say, well, and in particular in the Hawke-Keating area, we moved to enterprise bargaining, but we moved to get rid of rigidities in the system to make sure that the economy and individual enterprises were working better. Now, if those enterprises are refusing to share some of the benefits and the gains that have been generated that can be demonstrated in their better bottom line, and you've got 40% of CEOs saying they will not pay wage increases, and you see a government in the form of the federal government refuse the RBA's call to increase wage outcomes in the public sector, you've then got to wonder, well, is enterprise bargaining really going to deliver for ordinary workers and see them benefit from the productivity and the profitability that they can see, where shareholders and, as I said, senior execs are benefiting and they're not?
When it comes to that point of wage growth, we know that's been a huge topic, in particular in the last few weeks. Your colleague Stephen Jones has said one of the ways to stimulate wage growth is for the government to commit to an across-the-board wage increase for public servants to then spark private sector into competing. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what the RBA has pretty much flagged last week in their testimony before the House of Reps Economics Committee. And Steve has rightly pointed that, you know, the public sector can help start to stimulate consideration about wages outcomes. I mean, we have a government that says that they expect that wages will increase. Every budget they release forecasting thinking that it'll happen. It never does. They will not increase wages for the public sector. They have no game plan to encourage wage growth in the private sector. The economy, as a result of that, you can see some of the reports in the last week where that sort of tax stimulus that was put out there is there's a big question as to whether or not that'll have an impact and whether or not consumer sentiment will hold down the future growth of the economy. So what gives? Is it that we just see, as we've been talking through the course of today, Coalition MPs pushing penalty rate cuts, drops to superannuation increases and greater job insecurity, and then the government refusing to pay wage increases greater than what they're paying at the moment for the public sector, and we see working Australians basically left behind. I don't think it's acceptable longer term.
Just on a very different topic, we've seen discussion in the United States about the rise of these mass shootings and the need for them to be called domestic terror incidents and for there to be a specific focus on white terrorism. And you've been saying you want to see a similar focus in Australia.
Well, I spoke with your colleague last week, Kieran Gilbert, Annalise, where I asked why Osmin, whether or not it had received a briefing on what the US government is doing to tackle white power terrorism that has been in evidence in recent shootings, terrible incidents in the US, where those shooters actually said that they had been prompted to act as a result of what happened in Christchurch. You've seen some terrible material and manifestos posted on extreme websites like 8chan that are saying that they're out to outdo each other after what happened in Christchurch. This is a serious issue in the US. Concerns were raised in one opinion piece in the Sydney Morning Herald today by Nicole Hammer. She cited one former FBI official saying that it was hard in the FBI's case to do anything on white power terrorism because of the concern that it might affect the president's base. If there is a threat that is crossing borders and that is posing itself in the extreme ways that it has, this is a serious issue. We should know what the US is doing about it, and we should also have a better understanding of what the Australian government is doing to enhance national security in response to some of the extremist groups that are quite brazen in the Australian context, openly flouting their beliefs and arguing and inciting hate and violence.
The Australian security agencies have been extraordinarily successful in blocking terror attacks in Australia. Do you have any specific concerns, any evidence that there is that lack of action from the government on this issue of white supremacy?
Well, let me put it to you this way. If those incidents that occurred in the US were jihadist-inspired, do you think we'd be quiet about it this week? We'd be talking about it all of last week and all this week. And we'd probably have a number of things that have been flagged as for further improvements. If there are threats to national security, I don't care if they're jihadist-inspired or supremacist-inspired, they need to be tackled and dealt with and prioritised as a national security threat. And we certainly don't have any sense about what is being done to tackle white power terrorism. We don't see it in the US. We don't see it necessarily here in this country. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I just think that a lot of people do not want extremists on either side to be basically fueling themselves, trying to outbid themselves as to what they can do. We need to clamp down on this quick, and we need to understand what the government's doing in respect to this issue.
So what's your message to Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton? What would you like to see him do specifically?
Well, I'd like to know what work is being done to monitor and assess the threat. You know, what's being done to prescribe some of the groups? What's being done to prevent the distribution of material, either online or in physical form, that incites violence and hate? What are we doing with other jurisdictions to keep tabs on how groups are communicating amongst themselves and to determine whether or not there are any issues that might trigger a national security concern or potential incident? You know, these are the type of things that I think we should be seeing some sort of response from the Home Affairs Minister on, and a demonstration that this is being taken very seriously. As I said, like, you know, we shouldn't, I don't care if it's jihadist or supremacist, if it's posing a threat, it should be prioritised, tackled and dealt with.
Ed Husic, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Annalise.